So we're going to continue our statistics lecture on precision. So precision, as you might recall from the previous YouTube video, is measured with standard deviation. And standard deviation has a really big, chunky formula where the standard deviation, sigma, is equal to the square root of the sum of the individual trials minus the average trial squared. So you take the individual trials, you subtract it from the average trial, and then you take all that, you square it, and then you take all that, you add it all up. And then we divide by the number of trials minus 1. So this is a really big, chunky formula. The good news is both Excel and your TI calculators, if you have a graphing calculator, will do it for you. So the Excel formula is stdev.s, or if you don't have that option, just stdev. And then you select the cells, and it'll do it for you. The TI calculator, you go through and you do the one variable stats. And when you do the one variable stats on the TI calculator, it'll give you sigma of x, and that is your standard deviation. For information on how to calculate this via Excel, please take a look in Lab Archives under the Excel guide, and there's instructions on how to do it there. Now, for your significant figures are actually pretty straightforward when you're talking about average and standard deviation. So essentially, the number of decimals in the trials should always be equal to the number of decimals in the average, which should always be equal to the number of decimals in the standard deviation. So, for example, if all of your trials has one decimal and one decimal only, your average will only have one decimal, and your standard deviation will only have one decimal. When you report your answer, you always report your answer as your average plus or minus your standard deviation and then the unit. So for example, if my average was 5.43 milliliters and my standard deviation was 0.13, then I'd report my average 5.43 plus or minus my standard deviation 0.13 and then my unit. And this is how I would report my answer. This tells me that the range that I expect my next trial to be in is either 0.13 less than my average, so 5.30, or 0.13 greater than my average, so 5.56, and I expect my number to be within that range. However, none of this answers the question of, am I precise? Well, in order to determine if I'm precise, I need to calculate the RSD, or the relative standard deviation. And the relative standard deviation is calculated by taking the standard deviation and dividing it by the average, then multiplying by 100%. So in this example, my standard deviation was 0.13, my average was 5.43, and I'm going to multiply by 100%. And when I do that, I end up getting 2.4 making sure I only have 2 sig figs because of my standard deviation, 2.4%. So this would actually be considered not precise, although it's pretty close. Because in order to be precise, we want to be less than 1%. So in order to be considered precise, we want to be less than 1%. So this would be not precise. So I'm going to stop this lecture, and I'm going to give you another lecture on Excel on calculating standard deviations and how to report things properly with standard deviations.